Woolwich has always been remembered as a town with a strong history of labour and the trade union movement. Today, this place has over 40,000 residents and can clearly be seen to be a multicultural town. However, this enriched town was once known as the Woolwich Warren. The history of Woolwich and its armament production dates back to the 16th century. The origins of Woolwich lie with the creation of a dockyard in Woolwich by King Henry VIII. The dockyard was originally built for the construction of a ship called Henry Grace à Dieu, Henry Grace of God, also known as the Great Harry. The Great Harry was Henry VIII's flagship. It was built from 1512 to 1514 at the Gun Wharf in Old Woolwich, east of the area, which was later known as the King's Yard Woolwich or the Woolwich Dockyard. The ship was one of the first warships to feature gun ports and cannons. During the 16th century, it was undoubtedly one of the most powerful and the biggest warships in Europe. Following the tradition of producing armaments for Great Britain, the area further east of Woolwich Dockyard was built in 1671 under the name the Woolwich Warren with authority of the Crown. The Woolwich Warren was used for testing guns and strong ordnance. By 1696, Royal Laboratories were built within Woolwich Warren for the research and development of weapons. On this area, General Blake and his ordnance officers tested cannons. By 1777, the Woolwich Warren was the largest gun repository in Great Britain, covering an area of 104 acres with about 500 workers. In 1805, King George III paid his second visit. The first visit was in 1773 and suggested to rename Warren as Arsenal. The Master General agreed and, as a compliment to the King, decided to rename it as the Royal Arsenal. During the period of the Napoleonic Wars, the Royal Arsenal witnessed new buildings, notably the complex of the riverside warehouses known as the Grand Store. In the 1850s, more buildings were built due to the Crimean War. From then on, intense modernization undertook due to steam-driven machinery and the manufacture of even larger guns. By the end of the 19th century, the Royal Arsenal was among the world's largest depots for army stores and an arms factory without parallel. It deployed the heaviest and innovative machine tools ever invented. By 1907, the Royal Arsenal covered 1,285 acres in size. By 1914, Royal Arsenal was already a fully utilized site manufacturing large and small guns, ammunition, bullets and cartridge cases, limbers, wagons and ammunition boxes. When war was declared on the 28th of July 1914, Britain lost a large portion of its male workforce to the battlefields, answering Lord Kitchener's appeal for 500,000 men. On the other hand, there were vacancies to be filled in all types of industries at home. This led women to begin working in various ammunition factories in England. Meanwhile, before 1914, women had gradually stopped working in factories for some unexplained social reasons from 1872. But with the war and the shortage of the male workforce, there were so many needs, there was a demand for women to join the workforce. However, during the first 2 years of war, women were still a tiny minority in the munitions factories. The number of women munitions workers did not rise until 1916. According to historian Hogg's research, during 1914 there were about 9,466 men working in the Royal Arsenal compared to a very tiny minority of 125. However, by the end of the war in 1918, there were 24,018 women workers compared to 37,895 men. At any given time, women were never the majority. This was because they were always reluctant to employ women at their factories. As historian Elena Savade's attributes, the reluctance to employ women workers was perhaps due to the strong traditional belief that women were simply not strong enough. Indeed, in 1916, this view was reflected in one letter sent to a local newspaper, the Woolwich Pioneer, by a writer who titled the letter "One of the Boys." The writer wrote, "The statement that the women are on the same work as men is most misleading. These jobs are the easiest of any in the factory. They must realize the true position and learn that what they are doing is child's play." However, this statement was inaccurate, with the number of women and girls doing dangerous work in dangerous buildings outnumbering men. For many hundreds and thousands of women who entered the Royal Arsenal, it would be a long, tedious hours of work and constant fight for tolerable conditions. In the dangerous buildings, women would be allocated to new dangerous tasks such as the fuse inspection, shell making, cartridge filling. While they did receive 2D extra pay, working in dangerous areas would often result in health problems. Workers who worked in filling shields were prone to suffering from TNT poisoning, an explosive which would turn their skin yellow. As Miss Ethel May Dean, who worked at the Royal Arsenal, recalled,
TNT one, everything they touched went yellow, chairs, tables, everything.
Which included carrying very heavy shells and machines, would result in health problems such as back breaking and poor general health. Workplace accidents were not unusual at the munitions factories. The accidents would vary from minor injuries to sometimes even fatalities. Although the exact number of fatalities is unclear, Greenwich Heritage highlights there were 2 deaths of munitions workers in the Royal Arsenal during the Great War. The hard work and many challenges faced by women in munitions did not accord to their wages. At the beginning of the war, the first women munitions workers at the Royal Arsenal were paid the same rates as men. This was because initially there were very few women workers, and this would not harm the profits of the industry. Although this seemed to be okay in the beginning of the war, the stress on fair pay began to take place. By the end of October 1914, the National Federation of Women Workers took a stand against low wages of women. The lowest minimum wage, which they would not accept for women over 18 years of age, was 15 shillings per week. However, it is not known if the demands were met, perhaps because firstly, the numbers of women were quite low, and secondly, nobody tended to look at the women's union group seriously. Hence, the issue of unequal pay rate still continued. In September 1915, the women workers got an increase, 2D per week. However, this was still very inadequate and low compared to men's wages, which was 40 shillings per week. Although there were more protests and demands for the same rate, David Lloyd George still did not prove to be reliable. Finally, due to the efforts of 1915 to 1917, in January 1918, women munitions workers received a 10-shilling rise per week, compared with £1 for men. However, this was still not an equal pay rate. Besides all the daily hardships and low wage, the women munitions workers did endeavour to stay positive for the war and to enhance their environment. A journalist who visited the Royal Arsenal wrote, "Wherever the women are, the light and colour and flowers. The canteens were painted in white and pastel shades of green and blue. Bowls of flowers and plants stood on window ledges. There was a piano and deck chairs of bright coloured canvas." As the war drew to an end in November 1918, so did the war industries. Munitions factories began to slow down. The men were coming home from the war and they needed their jobs back at home again. This led to the immediate dismissal of 20,000 women workers within November 1918. By June 1919, around 50,000 munitions workers were unemployed. The women munitions workers faced challenges every day and suffered inadequate pay, only to be turned away when men came back. Indeed, the war did provide opportunities for women to be a little bit more independent than ever before. However, conclusively, the women were still never equal to men. Undoubtedly, it can be boldly said that their hardship and sacrifice eventually led to Britain's victory. One very important figure that made a big effort to improve the conditions of munitions workers at the Royal Arsenal was Dame Lillian Charlotte, who was appointed Lady Superintendent of the Royal Arsenal. Born in 1874 into a large family and raised in near poverty near Kentish Town, she combined her experience and sympathy to fight injustice throughout her life. She progressed from being a florist to a teacher at Whitelands College in Chelsea. Due to her astounding ability, specializing with troubled children, she ultimately became an assistant governor of Holloway Prison. By 1914, she ran her own progressive club, which sought to broaden the knowledge of working girls, stifled by long hours and slum surroundings, and thus her hatred of injustice was based on personal experience and radical Christianity. At the outbreak of the war, she joined Britain's effort by organising training of cooks for the army. Then in 1915, she was appointed as the Lady Superintendent at the Royal Arsenal. She was employed to recruit, encourage and allocate all female labourers, but she also took responsibility for welfare of 30,000 women who had replaced the male workforce. She was in charge of boosting morale, increasing production, housing, social and recreational activities. Conditions were greatly improved under her management, which earned her the name the best-known woman in England and mother of 30,000 women. In order to raise the money for exceptional needs, the Lady Superintendent Benevolent Fund was started, which would organise concerts, fetes and bazaars. She opened homes in the country and seaside for mothers and babies and even opened up nurseries. She also opened up concerts, gymnastics, fencing, painting, debating and embroidery clubs, which welcomed both genders. Rather controversial, the Woolwich Worthy said it was a daring invitation, especially with as many soldiers about. In return, she defended the women from bad reports locally and against the general public. Also, she accorded to dismiss a pregnant unmarried woman. Lillian argued she would only dismiss the woman if the man in question would also be dismissed. When questioned by welfare superintendent, she replied, "When you see a man with one arm around a girl, look the other way, but if he's got two arms around her, it's time to intervene." Even after the war ended, she kept going on to help women. Despite the sacrifice of low-paid income, in 1923 she agreed to govern the Aylesbury Borstal Institution for Girls. Whilst governing at Aylesbury, she again improved and brought better facilities. The prison-like environment was changed by the provision of plain-Santa clothes, food, furnishing and introducing activities such as swimming and games. She also gave nightly talks that inspired many girls. In 1935, she became the first woman Assistant Commissioner for Prisons. She was responsible for all women's prisons in England and Wales. She retired in 1943. Lillian passed away in 1955.